We know that there is a modernist faction in the church, and we know that they're implementing a modernist regime. I think that those individuals feel threatened that the Latin Mass is being recognized as the beauty and the treasure that it really is. So the Pope essentially explained some of his reasoning behind traditionis. As we know, traditionis custodes, motu proprio, published in 2021. Motu proprio means of his own volition. It's basically a command that comes directly from the Pope, and it's something that the Pope puts out of his own volition. It's invested with his authority. He's come out twice now. This is the second time that I'm aware of, at any rate, that he's come out defending or trying to explain or justify his decision. The last time was with a document last year that he published called Desiderio Desideravi. It was this lengthy letter sort of explaining his reasoning. And this time he sort of boiled it down, so to speak, when addressing Hungarian Jesuits. He said that essentially there's resistance to the Second Vatican Council. He said, and I'm quoting here, there is unbelievable restorationism, what I call indiatrismo, backwardness. The danger today is indiatrismo, the reaction against the modern. It is a nostalgic disease. After all the necessary consultations, I decided this restriction of the Tridentine Mass because I saw that the good pastoral measures put in place by his predecessors, Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI, were being used in an ideological way to go backward. Now, of course, when looking at this, we have two questions that are sort of presented to us. The first is, if the modern world is what it is, you cover, news stories yourself of, trans children mutilation, genital surgery, stories about homosexuality being promoted and lauded. You've got all this madness with like Dylan Mulvaney, the entire trans agenda, the whole LGBT movement. If that's what the modern world is, that and abortion, isn't it worth maybe reacting to, especially from a Catholic perspective? And then the second question is, isn't the Novus Ordo Mass, isn't that susceptible to ideological use as well? Especially when you have a number of priests and even bishops, prelates, who are promoting, or as you just covered with Bishop Sticca, defending homosexuality, homopredation, promoting the trans agenda. There was a parish in New York, in Manhattan, that recently got in trouble for putting up a series of art pieces, quote unquote, called God is Trans, on the altar. They have a beautiful altar. It's up on the wall. They have an altar rail and everything, but they put up this display called God is Trans, equating the sacrifice of the Mass and Christ's crucifixion to trans genital mutilation surgery. What we're seeing right now is two chief dangers with the Pope's restrictions on the Latin Mass. The one is, of course, the danger of restricting something ancient, beautiful, venerable, noble. As Pope Benedict XVI wrote in his letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum in 2007, what earlier generations held as sacred, referring to the Tridentine Mass, remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It can't be something that we consider harmful. We can't say that this Mass is what's leading people out of the church. That's the other danger that we're facing, is people being led out of the church, people going into schism in the opposite extreme, the far right schism, we could call it, as opposed to far left. People leaving the church in that direction. They embrace and love the traditional Latin Mass, which they should, but they love it more than they love the Pope or unity with the Pope. Under different circumstances, for example, under Pope Benedict XVI, this was not a choice that they had to make. The two weren't in contradiction. They didn't have to choose between loving the Pope and unity with the Church and loving the holy, noble, venerable Latin Mass, the Mass of the ages. That was not a choice they had to make. And that choice is now being foisted upon otherwise faithful Catholics. And some of them are choosing what to their eyes is clearly noble, beautiful, holy, venerable, ancient, and they're rejecting a lot of the programs that Pope Francis and certainly his cronies are implementing, things like promoting or endorsing homosexuality, the transgender agenda, a lot of this liberal, the idea of women being ordained priests. They see that on the one hand, and they see the reverence and nobility of the Tridentine Mass on the other hand. And that's clearly more appealing. I mean, it's certainly, to me, it's more appealing. I'm going to, in the words of the great Catholic novelist Evelyn Waugh, pray God, I will never apostatize, but this has become for me a bitter trial. I will always cling to unity with the Church and with the Pope, but it's going to be hard, especially as these restrictions continue worsening. And with people like Cardinal Arthur Roche as prefect for the, again, now dicastery for divine worship, it's going to get worse. And it's just a trial that we're going to have to face and suffer through. We know that because we can see it being played out in real time, we know that there is a modernist faction in the Church, and we know that they're implementing for lack of a better term, a modernist regime, or at least attempting to. I think that those individuals feel threatened that the Latin Mass is being recognized as the beauty and the treasure that it really is. And I feel that it was probably a particular terror for them when Pope Benedict XVI liberalized its use. It was no longer, just a matter of 2 to 3 orders, that were permitted to celebrate this, or you needed a special indult from the Vatican. It was now a matter of any priest in good standing in the Church can celebrate the Tridentine Mass. I think that was a great threat to the modernist agenda, to the modernist regime, which of course is not to say that the modernist regime or agenda, as we're calling it, is linked to or is intrinsic in the Novus Ordo Mass. But a lot of the portions of Vatican II they're good portions. The Vatican II is, completely valid, but portions of it, their implementation, the way that they've been interpreted in the post-conciliar Church, have been disastrous. They've allowed for such things as the Global Synod on Synodality, the Amazonian Synod back in 2019, the German Der Synodal Weg. They've permitted for these grandiose gestures on behalf of the modernist regime. And so I think that the modernists certainly feel threatened by recognizing that this thing, which the Second Vatican Council supposedly, at least in their interpretation, did away with, this thing is now, beloved. It's making a comeback. It's making a resurgence. They feel that their agenda, their interpretation of the council is threatened. Their interpretation, as Pope John Paul II, as Pope Benedict XVI noted, their interpretation of it was erroneous. But they feel that interpretation is threatened because there's now something really solid that can counteract it, so to speak. My take would be that this originates with Cardinal Arthur Roche. He's the English cardinal who's head of the current dicastery for divine worship and discipline of the sacraments. Roche is the one who published rescript clarifying points of Traditionis Custodes. Originally, Traditionis Custodes left it up to the individual diocesan bishops to grant permission for priests to continue celebrating the Latin Mass. And then it was up to the Vatican for newly ordained priests ordained after the publication of Traditionis, to get permission from the Vatican to celebrate the Tridentine Mass. Roche then published these rescripts just a few months ago, clarifying that no, actually the bishop, in order to give permission, has to seek first permission from the Vatican. That's not really a clarification, that's much more a revision. I think that this is much more a matter of centralizing power. I'm not sure that it really has very much to do with the idea of punishing. I think that might be, to some extent, a convenient excuse. I think personally, with all the things that Pope Francis actually says and does, I do think that he genuinely believes he's being pastoral, that he genuinely recognizes this threat of schism on the one side, and is trying to sort of bring people back into the fold, so to speak. The Jesuits, as you know, are a missionary order. Francis is a Jesuit. They're accustomed to going out to people on the fringes and bringing them back into the fold. This is just a fringe that maybe the Pope doesn't recognize as a fringe. Maybe he never understood that this is actually a fringe as well. These people erring in schism in the other direction, if that makes sense.
Wouldn't you agree, though, then, if that was the strategy, was to bring them back into the fold, then why would you suppress the TLMs that were being said in suburban parishes all across the country and the world? Because most Catholics, I hate to say it, they're lazy. They don't really want to drive an hour to the to the TLM community parish, the FSSP or what have you. They'd love to go 5 minutes to the closest parish where they might get a TLM on a Sunday, and they were getting that, and now they're not getting that because that was what was suppressed. It seems quite the opposite. It seems like they should have required a TLM in every Novus Ordo parish and then nowhere else, and then everybody would have been forced to go to the local parish, contribute to the basket there every Sunday, et cetera, et cetera. But now they're leaving. Now they're flocking that hour and a half drive to the chapel or to the TLM community some other place.
Exactly. Like I said, I think that it's much more a matter of trying to centralize power, because you now have Arthur Roche and the Dicastery for Divine Worship are essentially the sole arbiters of who can or cannot celebrate the Tridentine Mass.